So we want to welcome you to our talk. My name is Chelsea Jimenez. I'm currently a doctoral candidate in the urban education program here at the University of Pittsburgh, and I currently serve as a graduate student researcher in the Kinloch Commons for Critical Pedagogy Leadership.
Salutations, everybody. Thank you for being here with us. My name is Caleb Sewell. I am currently at this moment a first-year doctoral student in urban education here at the University of Pittsburgh, and I'm also a graduate research and teaching associate for the Center of Urban Education.
Today's event is part of a year of programming. In that spirit, thank you to Drs. Vaught and Dancy for creating and coordinating this year of study in the Black Fantastic. Thank you to Dr. Martez Files, Chris Wright, Emily Conklin, Caitlin Zurcher, Dr. Christy McGuire, Dr. Janelle Levy, and Chet Aguame for their contributions to the year. This year, the Practices of Freedom Project, Center for Urban Education, and Kinloch Commons for Critical Pedagogy and Leadership join in thematic study around education and the Black Fantastic. As Dr. Vaught described in opening her dialogue with Dr. Damian Sojourner, we come to the study, of course, through centuries of a horrifically violent world order and through recent years of both remarkable liberatory movements and change, as well as striking reformulations of repressive power. We have witnessed and participated in global uprisings for racial justice, massive labor strikes connected across seemingly divergent contexts, unwavering youth movements, and we've all experienced and observed expected counterinsurgent response, imbricate global escalations of state and allied citizen brutality. From increased militarization of police and militias to live stream unimpeded genocide in Gaza and now the West Bank and across multiple locations on the planet, to related and compounding ecocides, and of course to the vicious academic repression in the global north, brought to you courtesy not only of the usual suspects, but also liberal so-called critical forces in the university. In these contexts, we stay steadfast to the idea that education is the self-determined domain of peoples, and that its contemporary colonial occupation and weaponization is vast and brutal, but fragile. So as we embark on today's book talk and discussion, what ideas can we study, practice, and deepen as we continue the work of educational liberation and rupturing of Western hegemonic epistemologies? These are the questions of the Black Fantastic. What is the Black Fantastic, says Ecoishan? He states, it is not simply about spotlighting more Black faces. It is about establishing a shift in viewers' positionality and perceptions from looking at Black figures and struggles towards looking with them, alongside them, and in turn seeing the world as they see it. The Black Fantastic, he says, is our freedom. The Black Fantastic is liberation. We welcome you today to a year of education in the Black Fantastic, to the ongoing work of our freedom and our liberation.
And so we come here today, and I have the honor of introducing one of my favorite scholars, Dr. Wilson Okello. He is a transdisciplinary artist, scholar, educator, and author. He is currently an assistant professor of education and a research associate in the Center for the Study of Higher Education at Penn State University. Additionally, at Penn State, he is the director of the Black Study and Education Lab, which is a research and praxis hub concerned with exploring the potentialities of Blackness in educational research practice and policy. Dr. Okello is a widely published scholar, having written over 40 scholarly publications, working within transdisciplinary art forms, including spoken word poetry, storytelling, and music. Dr. Okello's scholarship engages various ways of knowing and being to inform how we understand and connect to Blackness. Drawn from Black critical theories and approaches, Dr. Okello's work advances research in knowledge production and human development. More specifically, he is concerned with how Black critical approaches make visible the epistemic foundations that structure what it means to be human and imagining otherwise possibilities for Black being therein. He is also concerned with how theories of Blackness might reconfigure understandings of racialized stress and trauma, qualitative inquiry, critical masculinities, and curriculum and pedagogy to create conditions of possibility in the education context and society at large.
And so today we will be learning from and with Dr. Wilson Okello and his new book on Blackness, Liveliness, and what it means to be human toward Black specificity in higher education. On Blackness, Liveliness, and what it means to be human extends Sylvia Winter's critique to human development and academic knowledge production, arguing that Black specificity can create new possibilities for Black being. Dr. Wilson Okello closely examines holistic development theory, aiming not to reform, but to reimagine the self it presupposes. Taking what he describes as a multimodal and multisensory approach, Okello engages a chorus of writers, thinkers, and cultural workers: Baldwin, Bombara, Brand, Hartman, Lord, Sharp, Spillers, Wilderson, and more, to reframe Blackness as a social, political, and historical matrix, going beyond the study of Black experiences, biology, or culture. Punctuated throughout by stunning images from artist Michael Owona, his Infinite Essence series, the book proposes and enacts a methodological attunement to Blackness that can guide theory, policy, and practice towards an alternative process for the benefit of Black living.
Absolutely. And so at this time, I want to thank Dr. Keller for coming today to talk and learn with us. And I also want to invite you all as the audience, if during this talk, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. And as we transition from the talk, we'll engage in a dialogue with Dr. Keller, where we'll ask questions and also engage with their questions that you are putting forth for us. So thank you, Dr. Okello, and we look excited to engaging with you on the Black Fantastic and this beautiful work that you're going to bring forth with us today.
I read somewhere that the universe was formed from nothing. A spherical region 13.8 billion light years in all directions. Lily laced, knotted and tied. In the beginning there was nothing. Pinned fine points combined in small pockets, gathered lint, thin and dense and insignificant. But for the cosmic inflation surrounding them, we stumbled into existence. As the essence of happenstance, a cosmic circumstance, celestial combustion, this is galaxy formation. Dust and stars held together by lack. Neither could hold its own weight. By lack, they are nothing without each other. By lack, there is nothing here. So let's stay together, stay put. Masses pulling each other close, affective attraction. This is no love story. Impossible to plan, life or escape, so we stay and trace safety in the weight of suns at our center, and interstellar circulation about lovers in orbit that found themselves in another and move in unison. And we are the afterlife of explosion, of collision, of cacophony, cooling and expanding, coordinated chaos, gravity gradually pulled elements into galaxies, and here we are, the artful articulations, residual remnants of the stuff left over. This is just a guess. Where light has had time to reach us, there could well be things beyond the cosmic horizon that have not reached our gaze, and there it is. On the pulsating pendulum of fantasy and fiction, we are held in place by order, sturdy and symmetrical. We bring order to dysfunction so it makes sense, so we have something to spin, and that doesn't work for me. Not when you've seen different. Not when you have asked differently, like, what does it mean to be black and alive? Perfectly and poetically rendered conversion of spiritual and empirical principles. I mean, blackness, divine, a garden of granular blossom, the source from which everything elegantly emerges, an implosion that organized the wayward skies, scattered galactics, fraction matter and sporadic atoms into something called home. How we move and marvel and magic. Have you seen what we do with space, with the elements of life, what we do with bare life, what we make of life with space? Have you seen what we can do when we are freely and fearlessly ambling along, fluidly filling voids? What of black holes when we are full and deep and still being discovered? Not out there, worlds with no shape or rhythm on the end of incense, lifting themselves into interstellar fiction, empty, waiting for someone to give name to a vacant radiance. We finding, making, and taking, and hovering and marooning, and doing something anew, like if nothing else is certain, we ascendant. A holy continuum of hydrogen, helium, lithium forged in supernovas, unfolding from the inside out. We are constellations, emergent imminence, Intimate and innate, pervasive and permeating intent to permanently define ourselves. We are plenty. Try to count them one day. All the ways we make futures in the now and now and now and couldn't get past the plane, the mundane moments and matters while pacing the pavement, skipping across words, double Dutch fusions and hand clapping and musing, the essays and lessons and creations, the rhythmic ripples, captivating compilations, those cascading comments, plucking the string of dim-lit skyways, dark and lovely instruments echo, provoking our glow in these cosmos. Make it make sense. We are here, defying logics in our fall and rise, the people who could fly and fruit and sting. Oh, death, where is thy sting? We infinite, unrestricted, the algorithms predicting the ways we end and over and done. Nothing lasts forever. I can't do this anymore. Like that should have killed me. You are lucky to be alive and here. How are you still here, breathing in there with no air? Don't you breathe the same air? Won't you celebrate how we last forever? That everything we need for extraterrestrial breath is in us. We absolute, always infinite, the numbers right before and all that follows of those who came before and those set to come after, a mathematical mystery, physiological impossibilities. This existence is just one millennia, infinite in the endless intricacies of individual inner worlds, how we shift and shimmer in surreal skies, how we inspire insights. Let astronomy study our starry and sprawling expanse, our pristine, enlightened inquiry with cosmic curiosity. Like, how do they do that? I read somewhere that the universe was created from nothing, but that idea doesn't work for me. We infinite, as in template, as in that from which we begin.
Have you ever in your entire life seen anything so beautiful? Have you ever in your entire life seen anything so beautiful?
Ashe, greetings and good afternoon, good morning, wherever you might be joining us from. It is a tremendous honor and privilege to share space with you all on this afternoon. I have a long standing admiration, as I mentioned to the team before we got started, just a long standing admiration for the work of the Center for Urban Education, Kinloch Commons, Pedagogies of Freedom project at the University of Pittsburgh, and in particular, the courage and clarity of Dr. Zilan Dancy and Sabina Vaught. I and many others appreciate your principled commitments and your deep love for minoritized people, for Black people. I shared this with Dr. Dancy, but the book we are in conversation with about today has an origin story that is connected to the center. It was at CUE that I learned about Miguel Awuna and his brilliant work that you had a chance to preview in this opening. I'll talk a bit more about what brought us together, but his work, Nomo Simi, Guardian of Space, it was the banner image for the Summer Institute at CUE several years ago. That work, it arrested my attention. And the larger series became an organizing frame for the book project. So to Dr. Dancy in particular, thank you for your vision and for the invitation to contribute in some small way to the good work that you are stewarding and coming alongside this tremendous team to lead. Again, many thanks to Dr. Sabina Vaught, Drs. Christy McGuire, Caleb Sewell, Chelsea Jimenez, Emily Conk, and the Practices of Freedom Project, Ken Locke Commons, and the entire team at the Center for Urban Education. I joined you from just across the way in central Pennsylvania on the unceded lands of the Erie, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, the Shawnee, the Susquehannock, and Wazazi nations, and I enter from a genealogy of Black writers, thinkers, makers, doers, and ordinary folk who have curated otherwise ways to be in this world. So I wrote the poem that opened this talk while thinking about the potentialities of Blackness as a celestial matter, not simply a piece of matter, but as a celestial matter. Right? Celestial bodies refer to those natural entities about Earth's atmosphere, right? Moons, suns, planets, asteroids, each moving through this vast expanse of space. They exist in relation to one another, forming a plural assemblage. In Toni Morrison's novel Love, the phrase, "Hey, celestial," for some serves as a shorthand for a transgressive ontology. Morrison writes, one day, while playing at the beach, at around 10 years old, the children hear a man call out, "Hey, celestial," to a young woman in a red sunbank dress. His voice carries humor, a private knowing, and a hint of envy. The woman, whose profile is etched against the seascape, does not acknowledge the call. Instead, she turns to the children, her face bearing a fine scar, a pencil-thin mark that could easily be erased to reveal a flawless appearance. Her cold, intimidating gaze locks with theirs until she suddenly winks, causing their turtles to curl with happiness. In this text, love, celestial, comes to denote the courageous, indulgent pleasure. Morrison writes, and from then on, to say amen or acknowledge a particularly bold, smart, risky thing, the children mimicked the voice crying, "Hey, celestial." I'm struck by the children's mimicry here. When we mark Black bodies as celestial, it gestures toward an Afrofuturist impulse that acknowledges how Black speculative thought has expanded both intellectual and creative possibilities. This act of calling out represents more than simple repetition. It signals the children's engagement with the disruptive possibilities of naming and embodying boldness. Through this hailing, they reshape their relational field, crafting a moment of recognition and joy that operates outside of normative social expectations. It mirrors the ways the Black fantastic operates, pushing against and beyond prescribed boundaries, engaging in acts of defiant imagination that reconfigure space, time, and identity. In this way, the Black fantastic, it does something that Afrofuturism does not, as it compels a deeper engagement with complex realities that would not erase constraints, but instead do something with those constraints that exceeds them. To locate something called a Black fantastic, thus, is to call for it, to demand it, to make worlds become what they must become, to search for it, not unlike the field-defining work of Richard Iten. Richard Iten's concept of the Black fantastic refers to those minor key sensibilities. And I can't help but think, Saidiya Hartman's revolution in minor key in her brilliant text, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, but those minor key sensibilities that emerge from the lived experiences of marginalized groups, such as the underground, the vagabond, those labeled as defiant. These notions of being exist within and in conversation and beyond the boundaries of the modern world. The term Black in Black fantastic functions as both a generic category of underdeveloped possibilities and a marker of subaltern interpretations of post-racial, post-colonial visions and practices. These practices are rooted in the lived experiences of those who occupy marginal spaces, generating an alternative framework for understanding cultural and political dynamics of interest. In our conversation, Aiden emphasizes the role of creative artists in advancing political movements by fostering sensibilities of solidarity, crucial for sustaining progressive politics in the neoliberal era. I appreciate Caleb and Chelsea's framing as it gestures toward this critical sense of solidarities that might sustain us in this particular era. He suggests, Aiden does, that the broader atmospheric and symbolic discourses shape the effectiveness of political campaigns in achieving policy objectives. The question of what territories and forms political practices might claim, along with the rhythms and temporalities that define Black desires, remains central to these contradictions. Aiton reads an exemplar in artists like Amiri Baraka, whose work, to follow Fred Moten, is in the break, it's in the music, in the scene, and in constant redefinition that highlights the dynamic and transformative potential of Black creative and political practices. In similar fashion, I think with Sylvia Winter across this text, who lifts the potential of Black creatives and creativity as a break from Western epistemological framing. She locates her analysis in the Black arts and aesthetics movement. For Winter, there was something different about this 1960s and 70s moment, because at that time is when we witnessed the emergence and coalescence of several anti-colonial, anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-poverty struggles around the world that were rocking the very foundation of Western and Westernized societies. Despite their very trajectories, they were all compelled for their own well-being to interrogate the many projects of domination. Black arts and aesthetics are ways of imagining responses to the quotidian and everyday conditions of capture and terror that structure Black life and living. Black arts, writers, creatives, and thinkers, they help to mark these coordinates against the quotidian acts of terror that animate Black living in the wake, right, as method. This movement was a call to consider Black flesh, Black optics, and ways of producing what we might call an enfleshed type of work. On this point, we might remember Larry Neal's 1968 invitation to consider the synchronicity of the Black power and the Black arts movement, suggesting first that the Black arts movement is radically opposed to any concept of the artist that alienates them from their community. This movement, right, is the aesthetic and spiritual partner, sister of the Black power concept. As such, it envisioned art that spoke directly to the needs and aspirations of Black people in the United States, but too in diaspora. In order, thus, to perform this task, the Black arts movement proposed a radical reordering of the Western cultural aesthetic. It proposed separate symbolism, mythology, critique, and iconology. The Black arts and the Black power concept both relate broadly, again, to Black folks' desire for self-determination, but more specifically, a genre of what it means to be on their own terms. Neal wrote, both concepts are nationalistic. One is concerned with the relationship between art and politics, the other with the art of politics. And here again, we might note the work of Richard Aiton in search of the Black fantastic. Neal is clear about the urgency of fantastical work, right? Of a right now, on time Black aesthetics, when he notes that the question of collective struggle is at the core of contemporary experience in the academy, I would add, and beyond. He calls on the Black artists to address this reality in the strongest terms possible, in a context of world upheaval, in the face of gross disregard for liveliness and living. For our ethics and aesthetics, they must match, right? Our ethics and aesthetics must interact positively and be consistent with the demands for a more humane, more than human world. I'll frame that as a question for you all. Do your ethics and politics line up? I want to suggest to you, as writers and creatives have before us, that the Black arts movement is an ethical movement. Ethical, that is, from the viewpoint of those most oppressed. Much of the oppression confronting the global South in this moment is directly traceable to the sensibilities of a Western order of knowledge. This sensibility that denotes who can lay claim to full human status and those who cannot. It is epistemically infectious and seductive. Do your ethics and politics line up? The Black Arts Movement believed that our ethics and aesthetics, for one, I took inspiration from this call and thus took seriously the writing of this book as an ethics project. What Oshun calls fantastic is what I might call liveliness. Whereas liveliness is past and to method, within which artists and creative thinkers, doers, and again, ordinary Black folks and figures from the African diaspora have and are grappling with centuries of Black presence in a Western context, wherein we are inclined and exist in terrains of terror. We do not simply exist as subjugated to terror, to think with Christina Sharp. Therein too are histories in the pursuit of liberation, of transformation, of resistance, of an extraordinary flourishing and futuring. What is Black being in the Western order of knowledge, but an insistence on the future as now? A grammar, a possibility. That is not only or simply an expression of what will happen in the future. Instead, something called Black liveliness is and must be concerned with the conditions that must take place for futures to be realized. The grammar of the fantastic can be understood as a power, as it were, to imagine beyond current fact and to envision that which is not again, but must be. It's a politics of prefiguration that involves living the future now, an imperative rather than subjunctive or imagined, striving for the future that you want to see right now in the present. I understand the qualifying fantastic in the Black fantastic as this radical, right, which is to say imaginative, speculative, and surreal provocation that seeing Blackness differently creates conditions of possibility for presence. Again, not in the future, but now. Black liveliness then might be the embodied manifestation of what Oshun calls the Black fantastic. Those creative, right? Those creatives and those creative practices that reimagine Black experiences, offering alternative realities or futures to challenge dominant narratives and structures, that blending of the real and unreal, the must be and needs to be real sensibility that constitutes, again, living in the wake, in this, the afterlife. Here, Black liveliness and the Black fantastic are theoretical tools that can give name to and speak back to the myriad lived and yearn for experiences of minoritized folks and assist in actualizing new movements and formations toward an otherwise life-affirming and sustaining way of being in the world that sits at the nexus of questions with no resolution, like, what are those methods for imagining new ways of thinking, of feeling, and doing in the wake of ongoing subjection? I want to think the Black fantastic thus as a convening of sorts, the symbolic, the ritualistic, the political, material strands of Black living as a way of being in and against the pervasive weather of anti-Blackness that enables us as writers, as researchers, as witnesses, as cultural workers, right, and kin and comrades, to engage the precarity of Black living in ways that might honor the complexity and messiness, the insight and revelation, right, that modes of Black presence offer. If we are to pursue liveliness, right, the fantastic, if we are to step into space or take up the Middle Passage as a heuristic for reading the Black past, not past, into futurity, if we are to insist on being seen on our own terms, to conjure new states or dream new worlds, to recognize our complexity and not turn from it in all of its strangeness and beauty, we must be specific. We might understand something specific as a focus on particular details, characteristics, aspects of something, rather than speaking in broader or general terms, right? It involves a certain type of clarity, precision, the avoidance, if you will, of ambiguity, ensuring that communication or understanding is as direct and unambiguous as possible. So with this idea of specificity, particularly the ways we might understand it in a Western order of knowledge. We might understand it again as clarity and understanding. Specificity helps to eliminate confusion, right? Making it clear exactly what is being referred to or discussed ensures that others can understand and interpret our meanings accurately. It might mean an effective style of communication, right? Being specific enhances the quality, if you will, of communication. It allows for deeper engagement, providing a concreteness, right, to ideas rather than abstract ideas, right? It allows for a sharper focus. Specificity for some means credibility and authority. It signals a deeper understanding of a particular subject matter. Shows that one is knowledgeable and has taken the time to grasp nuances, leading to, again, this credibility and authority to one's argument or analysis or creative work, right? It's a particular type or a practice of precision. This book pivots on a central proposition, however, and that premise is that Blackness disrupts. In this way, I'm thinking about the anagrammatical nature that Christina Sharp calls us to think about. In this way, her rendering of Blackness as anagrammatical suggests that whatever the meaning of a word or object is, as it encounters Blackness, that meaning falls away and new meanings proliferate. This is Black being in the wake, right? In the afterlife of enslavement, this is the anagrammatical. So despite the visible structure of an object or word remaining unchanged, right? Similar to an anagram, if you think about it. Its fundamental character is altered within the context of Blackness. Importantly, I understand Blackness in this case as a social, and political, and economic matrix that structures society and delineates who or what can be human. The corpus of Winter's work is calling on us to think about and expand a more expansive rendering of Blackness that at once can critique Western societies, but to take up the question of what it means to be human and call our attention to how society prioritizes what she calls the man as human, as fundamental to the order of knowledge. If this is the orientation of Blackness, then Blackness fundamentally disrupts the notion of specificity, right? And what I attempt to draw attention to as Black specificity in the text. The too often assumption when we grapple with Blackness, I believe, is that centering Blackness is synonymous with the study of Black people, cultures, history, politics, experiences, namely identity politics. And while I am concerned about culture, experiences, and identity, in the text, I'm trying to distinguish between what Winter calls the map and the territory, to get beyond these representational identity discourses and toward a demonic ground, right? Offering of and toward Black specificity is less about a concrete definition and more about calling forth genealogies of Black knowledge and cultural production. So in this preliminary vocabulary that I lay out at the beginning of the text, when I say abolitionist, again, I'm calling on a particular genealogy. I'm thinking of Nat Turner. I'm thinking of Denmark, Vesey, and Dessalines, and Louverture in Haiti. When I think about atemporal, I'm thinking with the traveling sensibilities of an Octavia. When I talk about the Black Atlantic, I'm considering the work of a Paul Gilroy. Freedom Dreams is to think with Robin Kelly. Palestine is to consider the ways Black liberation movements have, and in this moment, cannot be unconcerned with the genocidal logics confronting the Palestinian people. Zong, of course, is to think with M. Novase Phillip and her poetic treatise on the long incident of racial capitalism that jettisoned Black life, but could not drown out Black living. If we can be specific, I think we will locate Black being, Chelsea, in the garret and in the attic space, as both confinement and vehicle of escape. I think we will see it, Brother Caleb, in the whispers of the brush, the rhythmic sound of the tambourine, the whooping moments in Morrison's text of yonder, they do not love it. If we listen, if we attune to it, I believe we will see it in the richness of Black interiority. And so with that, I want to take a few minutes to read from chapter 1 of the text, after which I would love to engage your thoughts and your questions. Um, the image demands an otherwise viewing practice. It requires us, the viewers, to look and then, as if understanding that we might be tempted to theorize or project some manner of explanation, cause, rendering, or justification, the image invites us to stop, pause, and then look again. That one feels compelled to look, however, does not imply an invitation to question the veracity, legibility, or value of the image, nor is the image responding to negation. More precisely, it alleviates the burden of questioning and instead gathers us, the viewers, through the insistence and assertion of Black possibility without the need to prove its feasibility. It presses on our pupils, attaching itself to our retinas. This scene is one of vastness and possibility encompassed in what appears to be space, and yet it is more than space in the cosmic, universal, or spatial sense. The space seems to move back and forth across history, time, and place, both ephemeral and permanent. One might call this scene a world, a Black world. And still the idea of world feels too small and too final for the artistry. Theorizing Blackness as Dion Brand does in her sacred rememory of The Door of No Return, she writes that the door of no return is on her retina. As such, it becomes a heuristic, an optic for seeing and understanding Black minds and bodies in the diaspora. I understand Brand to be discussing a kind of refusal and seizure. Regarding refusal, there is a sense that Brand refuses to unsee the meaning of the door, where it led, what it destroyed, who could never return, and what it meant for her to bear witness. The door in this way is a holding place, keeping one's attention and requiring a reckoning with all that it means to be present, taken to, and responsible for. Still, it suspends one in the in-between, stepping away and into from which one can never return. One does not just see or unsee this fixture, they encounter it. They experience it as lived through the body, and as such, the body does not forget. I remember encountering the image at an urban research symposium. It felt like flight, unhinged and unashamed, like a people who could fly, climbing up on the gates. And they flew like blackbirds over the fields, black shiny wings flapping against the blue up there. As the tale goes, the people who could fly kept their power, although they shed their wings. They kept their secret magic in the land of slavery. And this rendering, this encounter was evidence the artists must have known the tale, had it told to them or read, shared, passed down. Even if not, they embodied the story and were sharing it anew so that folks full of the sea's misery and longing to breathe freely might encounter their secret, might feel their magic and mystery. The image sounded like whispers and sighs under the cover of night and a freedom song in the day. It was a refusal to stay and a blessing to go, to follow the tide beyond the face of fear, to open one's eyes to water waving forever. The image was fugitive and still, but not stuck in place. Seizure is the thrust of history and memory that comes to bear on the present and is always at work in shaping futures. One encounters history and they live in it. This is the afterlife of the door of slavery in the wake. For Brand, the door on her retina is a sitting in the room with history. Whereas one enters a room and history follows, one enters a room and history proceeds. History is already seated in the chair, in the empty room when one arrives. Where one stands in society always seems related to this historical experience. We, the people who could fly, perhaps are still always and already arrested by history, even as we transcend, however temporarily, its weight and grasp. The image was motivated seizure, whereas seizure is what it means to be pinned and pressed down and not destroyed. Seizure is enclosure, it is locked away in the hold, it is occupation and confiscation, stripping away and never having had. What is it about seizure? The experience, memory, or threat of capture and requisition that is capable of producing something so everlasting. I see in the image memory of revolution, of people that refused to be captured. So they fought and jumped, walked and flew away, tracing the history of revolts by enslaved people. In a Western context, the Haitian Revolution enters history as that which, according to French colonizers, was unthinkable. Amid seizure, domination in its varied forms, freedom survived on the minds and spirits of enslaved people. To the rational mind, there existed no model or conceptual frame by which enslaved people in Haiti could imagine futures beyond the compliance of plantation logic. Freedom, or an alternative to enslavement, thus was reasoned as more than a material impossibility. It was that which had no onto-epistemological framing. The image takes up this mystery of Black being, shedding notions of the docile and tranquil subject. The image rejects that which is unthinkable, opening itself up to everywhere and nowhere. Following McKittrick as it relates to Blackness, quote, there is no from, there is no there, or somewhere or place that a Black from is anchored to. This means that our historically present Black geographies, the Africas and the prisons and North Stars, are from nowhere, end quote. They are fictions, constructions dictated by the predicament of Black disavowal, or coding the human as the disavowal of Blackness. And yet, amid this disavowal, this nowhere, Blackness emerges. Black is in the break. It is fantastic. It is an absented presence. It is a ghost, a mirror. It is water, air. Black is flying and underground. It is time traveling, supernatural, interplanetary, otherworldly. It is in between the lines, and it is post-colonial. Black is bulletproof and magical, and in every dark corner, soulful, neo-soul blues. It is negritude, post-slave, and always enslaved. Black is like who? Black is like me. Black is everywhere and everything. It is make-believe and magic. The image as a portal to nowhere offers a template to reimagine the production of space, not through patriarchal and colonial project trappings. For example, we want our space to own our space, give us place, but instead as a project that engenders relations of uncertainty. The body in flight, floating in an ocean of Blackness, is luminous. A constellation in and to themselves appears content. It seems as if galaxies and interstellar systems are coursing through the veins, or are the veins, are the universe? Who and what worlds are they holding? As a cluster of dark matter, I, as a viewer, am transfixed in their orbit, gravitationally bound to their presence and possibility. The artist intimates, insofar as the geographic space of canvas permits, that there is a world where Blackness exists unencumbered. And in this way, the nowhere of Blackness is not rendered non-existent. Rather, it fosters an outlook that is structured by, but not necessarily beholden to, crass, positivist cartographies. Invoking a Black world understands that Blackness exists in the tussle of being, in reverie and terribleness, in exception and ordinariness. A sovereignty set up for and of Black people, where question and resolution dwell with and of Black people, conjuring the world as the artist dreams it into being, pushes against societal instantiations of progress, and liberal renderings in the United States political imagination, i.e., a better world for Black people. I type these words against the reminders, insert the myriad forms of anti-Black violence, of the exemption of Black humanity that proliferate indefensibly as ordinary, a consistency that could otherwise give way to surrender. The image refuses to surrender. It is a breach that obliterates time and space, calls into question and critiques methods that function to capture Blackness. As a rebellious offering, an unsettling feat, it demands that we leap, that we move precipitously to spring free and toward possibility. It lifts aesthetics as life-making in Blackness, form, and shape. Taking form, the project does not concede to reactive posture. Instead, the artist deploys resonance and affect as the instantiation of Black world totality. Returning to Brand's meditation on the door of no return and sitting in the room with all that the door represents, the writer elevates the rightness of feeling as knowing as germane to living and encountering Black worlds. Writing where one can be observed is relative to that history. All human effort seems to emanate from this door. How do I know this? Only by self-observation, only by looking, only by feeling, only by being a part, end quote. The implication, of course, should mean that aesthetics are not devoid of politics or racial formations or aesthetic phenomena, and aesthetic practices are racialized structures. Plainly, my encounter with the image was and yet is both discursive and material, an invitation into the everyday abstraction of Blackness. Society's lack of imagination for Black liveliness and living are part of the conditions that make for brutal reenactments on Black being. There is no assumption of Black humanity in the current order of knowledge, and yet the image, the canvas, assumes otherwise. I am interested in clarifying the otherwise, or what the artist, Mikalawuna, calls infinite essence. Infinite, or that which might be defined as endless, immeasurable, or inconceivable, divine and present within an inherent dwelling and state of being, encompassed and manifested in materiality everywhere and in everything, immanence, transcendence, eternal and absolute, everlasting, unending and measureless, incessant as in persistent and given to vigor, not easily deterred, incessant as opposed to blockage, barred or segmented, ceaseless, unremitting, and perpetual, infinite, as in relentless and not easily broken. Black is unbroken, though Black skin was broken, and lineage and family and language, we rise infinite and boundless, speculative and future, a commitment to expanse and expansiveness, vast and endless, infinite, as in dispossession and no possession, infinite, as opposed to static, intermittent, rigid, cosmological and ascendant, universal and always in development, infinite, as opposed to definitively captured, caged, confined, to be free and unoccupied and exercised in imagination and dreaming, infinite, living, surviving, the wake and afterlife, eternal as opposed to incarcerated, jailed, subjugated, to be consummated and liberatory, against redlining and redistricting and written out of, sovereign, relational, connected, ancestral and celestial, growth outward and inward and upward rooted, breathing deeply and fully, inexhaustible and indefatigable and diligent, infinite, the abstract, embodied affective range of emotionality as opposed to the concrete and cemented, place bound and stay in your place, theory and formulation, shape shifting, beauty, desire and performative, praised worthy of celebration and given to joy, unconditional and under all conditions, pertaining to the historical and future, omnipotent and a priori, lineage and inheritance, retrieval and remembrance. By assuming that an otherwise image existed, the Black body as transcendent, planetary, and of the cosmos and eternal, Mikalawuna introduces a seeing which runs counter to the idea of Blackness as a void, vacuous and blank. It is the type of viewing practice that animates this text. Blackness, historically, however, is grounded in the discardable, anti-intellectual, and beholden to death, yet darkness, read Blackness, as the animating frame critiques these violent projections and elaborates an alternative on the presumption that other relations exist. Black knowledge traditions here and throughout, referred to interchangeably as Black onto-epistemologies, are sites of knowing and being and possibility. Blackness is of possibility and makes possible for Owuna. This occurred with and through ultraviolet light, a form of radiation or radiated energy that emits but is often undetectable to the senses. However, temporarily, Owuna makes visible the unseeable therein. Following this premise, I'm interested in what Blackness makes visible or, quote, cites, end quote. Citing intimates that imagination requires a return to and engagement with painful places, worlds where Black people were and are denied humanity, belonging, and foremost citizenship. Thus, I grapple with the where and how of Black inhabitation against the myriad forms of disavowal. I do this deliberately, yet cautiously, so as not to trivially participate in the convening of Black death and dying. I believe, as Amana Perry does, that hope won't get us out of the funk of history that we live in today. The terror of now is as important a subject for the Black imagination as the speculatively beautiful tomorrow. In addition, that which is not visible, as in brought into view for understanding, is part of a larger settler colonial project that depends on displacing the centrality of Blackness. Thus, a broader import comes into focus for this project in my pursuit to call forth alternative notions of humanity divorced from the Western man as human that begins with and accounts for Blackness, transforming the human into a heuristic model and not an ontological fait accompli. Put differently, I ask, what does Blackness, as a practice and disciplinary frame, make possible for education, and more specifically, what is commonly understood as student early adult development theory? As one point of entry into Black specificity, there are others. I elaborate in what follows in this particular portion of the text on social and political death. The work of theorizing Blackness in the United States intellectual tradition is partially an investigation of the ongoing and sustained nature of Black exclusion from the socio-political dimensions of human regard. It reckons indefinitely with the insatiable thrust and established need for the denial of Black humanity and society. In doing so, I take seriously the ways chattel slavery, often contextually bound to a period since past in the United States, persists and overdetermines the life chances of Black people, and thus reflect briefly on the roots of slavery and its relationship to social death as a mechanism for understanding its contemporary manifestations and understandings of human development and knowledge production. I'll read this final portion and then I look forward to engaging with you all. Infinite essence materializes Black creative intellectual departure, the type of world making that self-definition strives to annotate. Loving Black flesh, Black specificity is attunement, again here, an ethics project, and a way of reading in excess, for example, embodied formations, images, scripts, society, etc., to both understand the workings of anti-Black logic, for more fervently trace Black liveliness, past, present, and future. Furthermore, this text intends to shift the reference point in human development and knowledge production discourses and educational theorizing writ large to avoid the trap of mistaking the map for the territory, of attempting to represent Black being through Western humanistic frames that are uninhabitable for most. Ashe. Thank you all so much for the opportunity to share just a bit, and I will turn it over to Caleb and Chelsea.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. That was so breathtaking and Black. The amalgamation of how you connected spoken word, music, and visual art was so beautiful. And I feel like transformational, especially to my own thinking about how I understand Black living and possibility. Even the pauses you took felt so intentional as you spoke. So we want to thank you so much, Dr. Okello, for such a thoughtful and deep engagement of your work and how we can engage with and understand Blackness, liveliness, and what it means to be human moving forward. At this time, Caleb and I will begin with the questions connected to our theme for the Black Fantastic and invite audience members to share any questions in the chat. In thinking about the Black Fantastic, Echo Ashen describes the Black Fantastic as the past, the future, the now, through rewriting the middle passage to inscribe Black pain into futurity. Similarly, your work, as supported by many brilliant Black feminist scholars such as Sylvia Wynter, Hortense Spiller, Saidiya Hartman, Catherine McKittrick, and Christina Sharp, take into account the atemporality of Black liveliness and Black living. Your work with the archives specifically makes me think of the critical fabulation work that Saidiya Hartman does with archives. Can you tell us how you utilize the concept and practice of otherwise knowledges and possibilities that you describe to help consider, interrogate, or imagine how archives and other non-traditional methods can be used to understand Black liveliness and living?
Well, first of all, thank you for those very kind remarks regarding the work. And thank you for just the beautiful engagement with the text and work. In order to get at a question like that, you have to read. And so if I know anything about again the intellectual community at the University of Pittsburgh, I know y'all read. So so thank you for again for that thoughtful question. So to get at practices or to get at otherwise knowledges and possibilities, to interrogate or imagine how the archives and other non-traditional methods can be used to understand Black liveliness and living. First, I think requires us to understand what we mean by otherwise. And so I think genealogically, I'm thinking about the work of Sean Crawley and his brilliant work on Black Pentecostal breath and the ways that he annotates the church-going traditions as ways of as mechanisms for meaning, right? So he talks about the shout, he talks about noise, talks about the whooping, right? But in particular, there's a cultural aesthetic, there's a church aesthetic, a Pentecostal aesthetic that he taps into that I found just really insightful. And so when I'm thinking about otherwise ways, I'm thinking about those that are typically not crystallized as ways of knowing, right? I'm thinking about Black knowledge and cultural production that happens on the playground, that happens in hopscotch, that happens when you're riding your bike, that happens when you dap somebody up, right? Like I'm thinking about all the ways that Black people have made meaning in being that oftentimes are not legitimated or don't often register as meaning-making mechanisms, let alone archives for intellectual possibility. And so it was a stepping out of what typically constitutes a knowledge archive or a knowledge canon, which we might read in the, an Enlightenment sense as this sort of high theory or it's the work that has been generated largely by white philosophy and sociology that has tracked its way into educational discourses. And so, as I'm attempting to sort of step outside of that and to think about an embodied sense, right? To think about all the ways again that that meaning happens, that language happens, um, that black people do life. I started noticing that again in the cultural practices, in the unspeakable, in the silences, in the gaps. There was archive. There was meaning being made. There was love happening. There was relationship happening. There was considerations for how we might be differently in the world. And so, so it was really again the otherwise that in response to your question was it stepping outside of what is traditionally framed as useful or legitimate knowing to better see or better attune, if you will, to the breadth of knowing and being that Black people do every day.
Thank you.
Does that get us the question?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. More ways than you know. And it makes me think back to another Black Fantastic event we had with Dr. Damian Sojourner, who also engages archives and how we understand them and what is considered archives and knowledge. So thank you.
Yeah, yeah. And I'll just pick up really quickly. I appreciate that. So the archive, you know, to think, you mentioned Cydia Hartman's work, and I'm thinking particularly about her piece, Venus, into her 2008 piece on where she talks about the limits of the archive in particular. And this notion of critical fabulation is brilliantly allows us, I think, is an otherwise practice that allows us to attend to what would otherwise be unknowable, right? Might we be able to imagine the lives that these girls, that these women lived, right? Might we be able to imagine the histories that they had, the intimacies perhaps that they shared, right? The intimate connections, perhaps the looks, the size, like might we be able to imagine differently how they be? And I think critical fabulation as an otherwise tool, as theoretical tool that is one such that allows us to do that because of the limits of, again, what sort of the Western order of knowledge constructs as archive, right? Which is to say those who have taken place in particular order for it to be interpreted in a particular type of way, right? Museums do this like as business, right? Like they construct particular ways of understanding an event, understanding histories, understanding ideas. And so in order for us, so part of what I think I'm arguing is that how do we move against the representations of archive, but also knowledge, right? How do we move against what has been constructed for us such that we might be able to see all that, you know, everything else that is there. So, so thank you for that point and for calling on Cydia Hartman's work.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I want to also honor that with this question that is interrogating the otherwise in education, right? In the last chapter of the book, you write, quote, "The quintessential query that emerges with regard to Black people in higher education is what are the higher educational futures of Black people," end quote. You say here, educators and researchers are largely carceral logics, manifesting as the carceral imagination, which is constituting technology that determines the futures and life chances of Black people, end quote again, which is from page 231, if anybody was writing that down. But my question for you is, with that, right, how do you trouble this notion of Black quote unquote educational futures move towards how you describe the sound, look, feeling, and work of Black study, right? And
Yeah.
why is this move important for those who want to take Blackness and anti-Blackness seriously in education, right? To disentangle ourselves with this Black educational futures framing.
Yeah. Yeah, such an important question, Brother Sewell. So I'm thinking about this in a couple of ways. One, I want to understand So one first think about Blackness as capacious, which is that which is able to hold again possibility, love, futures, and to social and political death and terror and disregard, right? And so for me, it was really important to not try to sort of wedge um, unnecessary distinctions into a definition of Blackness, right? Like to cast it as, it's the Afro pessimist versus those who like only believe in like that's. I'm trying to think more capaciously about Blackness as that which can hold all. It can hold all of it, right? And so not without tension, right? But it can still hold, right, and exceed or do something with that tension. I think that exceeds them. So so I appreciate that. But in two, I'm thinking about so Black education exists as part of the neoliberal imagination, which is to say that as Black people, again, holding that Black has always been understood outside of what it means to be human, right? The inclusion of Black people, right? Quote, and I'm sort of air quoting, the inclusion of Black people into what we might understand as a sort of Western system has never been without tension, right? It's never been something that was, done of benevolence, right? Like, or just like this is something a natural evolution of society. Like this, it always happened in tension, right? Which is to say that whatever the Western imagination can construct for Black people is always going to be and hold that memory of Black as non-human, right? There is no future that the educational system can imagine for Black people that exists outside of Western orders of knowledge, right? And so, because I hold that as fact, I'm interested in what, again, how we might locate the ways Black people desire what Black people desire for themselves, right? Which is to say, and I think to get at that we need a different methodological approach, right? It's not simply a sort of Western traditional framing that is, what do we want for Black people, so much as how might we reconfigure this to get at the embodied ways Black people are moving and always marooning, if you will, like always moving toward futures constructed of their own sense making. I'm thinking about Savannah Shange's work in progressive dystopia, and really the litany of Black cultural production that has talked about the ways Black people have moved against the plantation logics of the Western order of knowledge, constructed as K-12 education and higher education. So really, again, I'm most interested in the sensibilities that Black people have for their own futures and how attuning ourselves differently to Black people, which is to say, again, beyond this traditional framing that says, what do you want for yourself? And rather, right, like how might we attune ourselves to the ways Black people are already telling us, have already told us what they desire for themselves. Does that get at your question?
Absolutely. Amen. And
Okay.
I really appreciate that. We have a question in the chat for you, Dr. Okello, as well.
Yeah.
Dawson, and it says, as we try to work our ways through the various and increasing forms of scholasticide against the kinds of imagining teaching your work so beautifully points us to, please elaborate on your call for us to, quote, mistake the map for the territory, end quote. I think that's such a good question for us to think through.
Yeah, when I think about uh, the various forms of repression that are happening in the United States, anti-DEI legislation, the the symbolic, the book bannings, just a number of efforts that have been deployed to restrict access to diverse ideas. But I'm thinking here just particularly Black ways of knowing, Black cultural production, Black knowledge production, right? There's, again, I make this sort of central argument that in those texts and books and like is our forms of knowing, or like ways of knowing, right? And to not have access to those is participate in a particular type of repression. And I'm also thinking about the devastating sort of scholasticide that we're witnessing, and that we witnessed in Gaza with the destruction of every major university and in schools and cultural centers and museums, right? And so, you know, something beyond the legislative and symbolic that really gets at the material ways that scholasticide is coming to bear on the lives of minoritized people. And so, you know, as I think about how we might elaborate on the map and the territory, my read and understanding of first the map is, again, the ways that we key into I'll say representational politics or identity politics that that in some ways divides the energy of our analysis, or divides the specificity of our analysis, right? So we end up sort of tracing and rightfully so, right? There's important work happening here. I'm not suggesting that this is unimportant, right? But we ought to, right, think about the lives of you know, Black men in education. We ought to think about the lives of Black women. We have to think about the lives of trans and queer and gender non-conforming folks in education spaces and beyond. We absolutely ought to do that. And in what ways are these interrogations divorced from thinking about a structural analysis that might allow us to undo how we have come to construct identity politics in and of themselves, right? And so, because I think to do so points us back to the ways that the human, right, was only ever constructed for a particular type, right? To think with Winter, the white male, bougie, sort of bougie class, property owning individual, right? Like that was it, right? And so identity politics sort of it sort of splits out as ways to try to sort of think ourselves in some ways into this human register. And I think a territory framing, right, allows for a deeper structural analysis that allows us to think, as Winter might note, not about what is human or who can be more human, but about genre, right? How do we disrupt the genre of what it means to be, which upsets even like the idea of what it means to be human altogether, right? Which gets us and points us toward this more than human anecdote. So what I think can happen, let me say that differently. I think it's important that we do that work, and there are people who have done that work and continue to do that important work. And how do we, in that work, how do we ensure that it's connected to a deeper structural analysis, particularly an epistemic framing that orders how we think, how we know, how we see, how we be in society toward a genre, like toward notions of genre that would allow us to undo, I believe, the intricacies of this idea of what it means to be human. I hope that gets at the question that was posed to Kip Dawson.
Thank you. And I think too, what you brought up in chapter 1, you talk about or take up Winter's idea of identity versus genre, right? And you're defining them And so I appreciate you bringing that forth as well too, for us to engage deeply.
Yeah, thank you for that.
This is so good. In reading and listening to the work of both Echo Ashun and yourself, Dr. Okello, I was extremely drawn to the ways in which you both grapple with, but also utilize various connections of space and place to envision and understand the Black Fantastic. For example, while many of us as humans, or shall we say beings, connect to the land that we live and breathe on, both yourself and Ashun describe possibilities in the water and in the sky. You write to readers of your book about flying and floating, but you also beautifully wrote to your son, August, about the waters and the skies. Can you speak more to how flying, floating, and connecting in otherwise ways to the water, the sky, and other spaces can help us understand Black liveliness, living, and possibility?
Yeah. Thank you for that. Beautiful question. And so my attempt in doing that was to think ecologically, as and more broadly to think geographically, right? To think about what the potentialities of Black geographies in the ways that they have always opened up ways that we might be differently, right? Black being, I would argue, is a spatial matter, right? Like it is, in fact, particularly thinking about the ways that we are inundated with, this social political arithmetic that that structures life in the social sphere, right? But I'm also drawn to the ways that Black people have constructed, again, how to be differently within those confining spaces, within those devastating geographies, right? How they unmade and remade those geographies, right? Those spatial how they unmade and remade those landscapes, if you will, to do life differently, to imagine themselves now and into the future, right? I'm thinking about, I've talked about, written about Harriet Jacobs and her confinement to the crawl space of her grandmother's house for 7 years, right? That 9x7x3 space, right? To escape racial and sexual violence. But in that crawl space, again, this 9x7x3 space, she's able to talk about joy, right? She's able to maintain relationality with her community, with her children. She says she heard her children, and that was helped to produce joy, right? So I think about the ways that even in these devastating environments, Black people, people of color, minoritized folks have thought about how to engineer different ways of being, and so. Notions of escape can be both literal, right? As in, how do we psychologically or spiritually uplift and fly away from this particular place? And it could be material. Folks were running, folks were jumping, folks were leaving behind, right? I mean, and so folks were gathering, and I mean, they're, I'm thinking about the clearing space, right? Like, so however temporarily, but we can come to this here in this place, right? We could be flesh, what Toni Morrison writes in Beloved. So I think about the ways that how attuning to how linking the speculative with the geographic has always been part of the long genealogy, I think, of black being and how to be. And so I read, to my son August, The People Who Could Fly, and the various iterations of it. And so right now it's about floating and flying away. And one day we'll have a conversation about what that means in a material sense, right? What that means to sort of ground ourselves in the ethic of what it means to sort of float and fly away, right? And so I think I attempted to sort of think again both speculatively to bring the speculative to the material as a way to consider the long genealogy of Black ways of knowing.
Thank you so much. That was so beautiful.
Appreciate that. I'm thinking too of something you said on page 11. And you said, while I understand the impulse to empirical evidence as that which is legitimate and can translate to effective policy, right? The priority for this project, which in turn will lead to sharper, more precise consideration of educational transformation, is in shifting how we think and write and approach our work as opposed to what we do, right? And so, this makes me think too of how in education we have sometimes a clinging to the idea of Monday morning solution, right? Or the practice. What's the practice of this? What's
That's
the
it.
reality of this, right?
That's it.
Um, and so I'm wondering, through your work, right? How are you leading us to prioritize how we think and write and approach our work instead of this is the what we do, right?
Yeah.
When it comes to
Yeah.
taking Black specificity and anti-Blackness seriously in the ways you do, and Black liveliness in the ways you come to know it as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Such an thank you for that brilliant question. And yeah, the that's it. So I'm not opposed to outcomes. I'll say that. And to your point, I worry about the ways that um, we might marry ourselves as part of, again, I think a larger neoliberal sort of framing of education and society. We marry ourselves to um, empiricism and what can be proved and scaled up and all that, whatever the language of outcomes and assessment becomes, right? Like that's what filters into our work. I think to a fault, because what happens is that theory we don't take theory seriously, right? What happens is that we can write about Black people without having to theorize Blackness, right? What happens is that we can write about um, we can talk about anti-Blackness, but never have to deal with the permanence of it. It's something we can work out. Perhaps um, you know, no shade. I'm not even. I was going to say no shade. I don't want to. I don't want to shade anybody. So like, but I'm saying there are particular ways we construct solutions to these deeply permanent these deeply permanent projects. And so one of the things I do in the book, in the latter chapters, as I point us toward what I call a theoretical practice. I think we get tied and married to this idea of theory to practice, and what I'm motioning for is a slowing down, is a taking theory seriously and moving toward a theoretical practice that first understands ourselves as embodying the theory, as taking up, right, the weight and the depth of Blackness as capacious, for example, before we ever think about having a conversation with somebody about it, and let alone moving it into some project proposal or some grant proposal and suggesting that it's going to be the thing that it moves us towards, they'll use the language of inequality, right? Like, and so I'm calling for, again, this theoretical practice that is that I believe, or that I'm hoping is an invitation to one, take theory seriously, and in this case, take Blackness and the long and layered genealogy of Blackness seriously. Period. Full stop. And then let's see what happens when we do that, right? Because I suspect that as we do so, our work will have to shift. And in shifting, then I think we can begin to imagine ourselves differently. Like there's nothing new coming from the United States political imagination. Spoiler alert, like there is nothing new that they're going to be able to imagine outside of itself. But if we can take seriously these ideas, I believe then it can help us to conjure the Black fantastic, right? To help us to imagine perhaps Black liveliness. in ways beyond the constraint that is already thrust upon it.
Thank you so much for that. It reminds me of a scholar, future Dr. Holly Graham. She calls that getting to the thing, right? And so I
Get
appreciate
into the thing.
getting to the thing, absolutely, with
Get
that
into the thing.
with that question.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much for making the time to speak with us today, and not just to talk about your book and your work, but the way you prepared your talk that we began with. I've never learned in a way like that, so interdisciplinary. So we would like to say on behalf of everyone, thank you so much, Dr. Okello, for talking with us about your work and your book. It was amazing to learn from and with you today, especially in such formats that are often not considered or centered as knowledges and literacies of Black peoples. We're grateful for you coming to the space and challenging our ways of knowing, learning, and being. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And before we depart, Dr. Keller, anything else you want to share with us at all, or leave us with anything you're thinking through, working on, or just being present within this current moment for us to take away from this space today?
You know, I'll end where I began. Just thank you to Dr. Dancy for, you know, when I reached out and shared that the project was becoming available, you know, that you took seriously the idea and considered it something that this brilliant community could be in conversation with means a lot. And so thank you to Dr. Dancy, but thank you to, again, Dr. Vaught and just the entire team for your careful work. There are a lot of folks looking to you all for direction, I think, in these perilous times. And so just grateful for your ongoing work and honored to be in conversation with you all. Thank you. And thank you all for joining. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you to our audience members as
Yeah.
well. I see the hearts and we really appreciate the engagement.